Why, John, do you think history is so fabricated?
Well, it's a very wide-ranging question, that, but the very short answer is that there are a few thousand people who try to control the whole of humanity. So a few thousand people try to control an alleged 8 billion of us, and the only way they can do that is through, well, several ways, but one of the main ones is by faking our history and science and creating this idea that we're just a speck of nothingness, because that takes away our spiritual power. In other words, our power to actually stand up against them. So they create this fake story of history and reality, and this just, as I say, it just takes away our power, and that's it in a nutshell, really. There are so many other elements to it as well. I mean, they keep us in control through fear. Fear is a big one. My books really just tell that story.
Why the Titanic, though?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's always fascinated me ever since childhood, and I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that. It's just such it's one of those stories that's got an element of everything, isn't it? It's got romance, it's got tragedy, rich versus poor, good versus evil. If you take the official story as gospel, it has just about every element that makes up a successful novel. And the whole thing just seemed so surreal to me and unbelievable to me, and that's why I decided to look into it a lot more deeply. And that began in the very early 2000s, around about 2005. I just kind of started messing around with it, looking into it very sort of cursorily. And as the years went on, I did some really serious research, and I did around about 3 years solid research just on Titanic. And this resulted in my book, RMS Olympic, which is the real Titanic story.
Why does the Titanic matter, though?
Well, like anything, people say to me, why does it matter? Why does X matter? Why does Y matter? It's all part of the bigger picture, isn't it? If they're lying to us about the Titanic, which they are, what else are they lying about? And of course, everything's interconnected as well. So this is just one tiny little piece in a huge jigsaw puzzle of fake reality. And when you tie the whole lot together, it creates a very different picture to what is presented to us by the mainstream. So yeah, it's important in that it is just part of a much bigger scenario of fakery, if you like.
I don't know where to begin, so just take me back.
Okay, well, I think the best way to do it is to take it chronologically. Well, first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about my research. That's probably a good way to start, wasn't it? Where I got all this information from. As I say, I spent about 3 years solidly doing this, and this is from about 2010 to about 2013. And where did I look? I looked at after the event, there were 2 public inquiries. There was the American one, which was the first one, and then the British one, which followed shortly afterwards. And there are transcripts of these inquiries that exist, and I looked at those in great detail. Most of the entirety of the transcripts appear on the internet, or they did. I've not looked at them for many, many years now, but at the time, that's where I got a lot of information from, just looking at the inquiry transcripts, and that they are very, very revealing. And again, I'll come on to that as I tell the story. I also looked at Harland and Wolff public records. Harland and Wolff were the shipyard in Belfast that built Titanic and its sisters. I looked at various archives. I've trawled the libraries, looking at all the contemporary newspapers at the time, which again often tell a totally different story to the one that we commonly hear. The ubiquitous internet, of course, which as time has gone on, a lot of stuff has been censored now, whereas back in those days it wasn't as bad, although there was still some censorship going on. And I also looked at something else which was very revealing, and that was the Marconi wireless transcripts. The Marconi wireless transcripts, which are only available in the Bodleian Library in Oxford and don't exist on the internet in any kind of usable way, they were all the messages that were passing between the ships in the North Atlantic at that time. Marconi being the system that was used then in the very early days of wireless, because obviously in 1912 they had wireless communication, but it wasn't every ship that had it, and it was also very, very rudimentary. You know, for example, there was no voice wireless; it was all Morse code. So, but those have been transcribed, and they're available at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, in England. So, yeah, I spent a few days down there. I say down because it's south of where I am. And yeah, so that was that. And then I did a presentation in about 2011 or 2012, I can't quite remember. I made a PowerPoint presentation of all the facts that I'd gathered together very shortly after I'd finished writing the book. And I did and that went viral on YouTube, and that within about 6 months it had about 500,000 views, and as far as I'm aware, it's still got 500,000 views, because this is what they do. They actually censor the numbers of views on YouTube, as I'm sure most people are aware, or many people are aware. But anyway, the point that I'm making here is that someone saw that YouTube presentation, and it was a Hollywood film director, not a well-known one, but a minor Hollywood film director, who invited me over to try and raise money to make the alternative film. So I spent some time over there, and the idea was to go around all different producers trying to raise money, which we did, but no takers, and except one guy or one person who said, we need a book. So that's why I ended up writing another book, which was Titanic's Last Secret, because it had to be a novel. So I wrote the book Titanic's Last Secret based on RMS Olympic, which is the factual book. And anyway, it was still rejected, to cut a long story short. So that's how the whole thing began. But yeah, let's get into the real story, if that's okay with you now. There is so much information to partake here.
The real story. Well, we all know, John, that the real story is the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. Yeah, and the moon's made of green cheese as well, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm afraid that, the official story, it was actually a book written by a guy by the name of Walter Lord, who was a CIA agent in the early 1950s, and the book was called A Night to Remember. Some people may have read that, or they may have even seen the film, which was made a few years afterwards, starring the British actor Kenneth More. But the fact that a CIA agent wrote a book about the sinking of an ocean liner 40 years previously kind of begs that question: what on earth was a CIA agent doing that for? And distorting all the facts too, as we'll see. It was all rather strange to me, and anyway, my research bore that out. So yeah, for those who are not aware, the Titanic incident happened at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, the 14th of April, 1912, and the ship sank approximately 3.5 hours later at 2:20 a.m. on Monday, the 15th of April, 1912. And there are two strands to this story, so we're going to look at them chronologically. In 1908. A gentleman by the name, well, I use the term very loosely, a gentleman by the name of J.P. Morgan. He was head of the huge conglomerate corporation of the same name, and it still exists today, J.P. Morgan and Partners. financial organisation, but he was also the ultimate owner of the White Star shipping line. He decided, he was a very bright guy, give him his due. He decided to build 3 luxury liners with a mandate of becoming the most luxurious in the world. And these were the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. And so he commissioned 3 almost, but not quite, identical ships to be built, and commissioned Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast to commence construction in 1908. Now, it was very foresighted, because up until that point in time, shipping lines only criteria, if you like, was speed. Okay, they weren't interested in luxury or comfort. It was just a means of getting from A to B, so speed was the most important thing. But he decided to go a different route, and so he commissioned the building of these luxurious liners, and it was a massive success initially, because everyone wanted to travel White Star Line. They were the best. Okay, but the problem with it was there was a massive investment of money was required. This was financed by JP Morgan himself personally, and it was a huge gamble. This plan depended on absolutely everything going right from day one. But as we'll see as I go through it, the whole enterprise was beset with problems, ultimately ending in tragedy, of course. Now, RMS Olympic was the first one of the sisters to be completed, and she was launched in 1911. And unfortunately for Morgan, bearing in mind that he'd invested a lot of his own personal money into this, and it was very, very heavily dependent on everything going absolutely spot on correct. But she, RMS Olympic, had 4 serious accidents, all before the launch of Titanic, which was a year later. So in other words, all in the first few months of Olympic's life. First of all, she, on a maiden voyage, when she arrived in New York Harbor, she destroyed a tugboat. White Star Line was sued. Fortunately, no deaths occurred, but it was a bit of a setback for the company, etc. I think they were fined something like $10,000, which, okay, is not that much money in the grand scheme of things today, but in those days it was a lot of money. Okay, and then secondly, on a subsequent voyage, she ran over a sunken wreck at Sandy Hook, which is just off it's a bit further down the coast from New York, and is also famous for another false flag incident, which we won't talk about today, but some people that will ring bells with some people. So that was Sandy Hook, and this caused severe damage to her propellers, and she returned back across the Atlantic at about half speed, but still suffered further vibrational damage due to the imbalance caused by the propeller damage, and 2 propellers had to be replaced. And then shortly afterwards, on another voyage, a few weeks later, she hit a sandbank, ran aground, and threw a propeller. Through means shed propeller. And this also had to be replaced, but having used both spares, they had to borrow one from the Titanic, which was still under construction. And this is significant, and we'll return to that point later. So please make a note and remind me to return to the propeller issue if I forget to do that, because it's important. Then, in September 1911, Olympic was involved in the worst incident of all. She was involved in a massive high-speed collision with a British Navy battleship called HMS Hawke, and this is known in Titanic circles as the Hawke incident. After leaving Southampton Water off the south coast of England, she was preparing to turn westwards, travelling clockwise around the Isle of Wight, and she came into contact with this battleship called HMS Hawke, which caused severe damage. And there's pictures of the damage in my books.
Sorry, I'm just trying to think, John. How did 2 big ships bang into each other?
Right, okay. Well, what happened was the battleship was going too fast for the little stretch of water that they were in, and its steering mechanism jammed, and they couldn't avoid it, and it hit RMS Olympic amidships. So yeah, it was an absolutely Well, it was nobody's fault. It was a mechanical failure, but it was, it was the crew of HMS Hawke that,
Yeah, but but the ship was quite damaged.
Yeah, it was very, very, very badly damaged. Yeah, and so it limped back to Southampton to be patched up. The patch up took 2 weeks, and off it went back to Harland and Wolff Belfast for full repairs. It had to go back to Belfast because it was the biggest ship in the world, and it was the Belfast dry dock where it was built. The Thomson Graving Dock was the only dry dock in the world big enough to take it. So when they got her into the dry dock in Belfast, which took a long time to get there, she had to go, incredibly slowly. It was realised that she was in far worse shape than originally thought, and worse still, after every incident with a Royal Navy ship, there has to be an official Royal Navy inquiry into any accident, and they found Olympic's crew, and therefore White Star Line, culpable, to blame. And the White Star was therefore liable for many, many millions of pounds of expenses for repairs to both ships, plus significant loss of revenues whilst Olympic was out of action. She wasn't able to ply a trade back and forth and start to pay her way. And amongst many, many other relatively minor issues, the major problem was that Olympic's keel was bent and distorted out of shape. The repairs were estimated to cost more than to build a new ship from scratch. Now, as part of my research, I spoke to several seafaring people, several mariners, and they all told me the same story, and that is that a twisted or a bent keel equals a total wreck. So White Star now realised that Olympic was damaged beyond economic repair, and significantly that she was also insurable, therefore an insurer's write-off, and White Star Line had no option but to declare a wreck. She was Olympic. It's categorically no doubt at all. It's documented. It did actually happen. Olympic was officially declared a wreck, a write-off. As I say, documents prove that to be the truth. And also, of course, as I said before, due to the serious damage, she wasn't able to ply her way back and forth across the Atlantic in order to begin to pay her way. And at this point in time, the bankruptcy of White Star and Harland and Wolff was definitely on the cards. So I believe that at this point, Morgan and his co-conspirators, because that's what they were, then hatched a cunning plan, to kill two birds with one stone. To solve the White Star financial problems and to remove opposition to the Federal Reserve in one simple move. And I'll come back to the Federal Reserve thing in a minute, but let's carry on down this thread for a while. And so this involved patching up the wrecked Olympic as best they could, bracing the twisted keel with metal struts. And interestingly, when Robert Ballard discovered the Titanic wreck site in 1987, he actually didn't, but that's another story. He was puzzled to find these struts in the wreck, which did not, of course, appear on the construction blueprints. And furthermore, it's possible to see the alleged repairs that Olympic underwent to its superstructure and its steel plates in some pictures of Titanic prior to its maiden voyage. Quite easy. There are a lot of pictures that show these damage repairs in pictures of Titanic. So therefore, I think everyone knows where I'm going with this. This was setting the scene for a remarkable and elaborate scam, which was the switching of the identities of the two ships. The almost completed Titanic and the almost wrecked Olympic. And this fact is corroborated by many Belfast ship workers' family who've had this story passed down to them through their families. How do I know this? Because in about 2011, I put an advert in the Belfast Telegraph inviting people to meet me who were descendants of the Harland and Wolff shipyard workers at the time, and three people came forward. I met them all individually in a pub in Belfast, and I took down the stories, and every one of them told the same story, although they didn't know each other. They didn't know who they were, these people. They didn't know the background or anything, but they told me the same story, and that was their relative who'd worked in the shipyard at that time had been threatened that if they breathed a word about what was going on behind those dock gates, that not only would they never work at Harland and Wolff again, neither would any of their families, and even worse than that, they would never work anywhere else in Belfast either. So it was it was quite a dramatic story in that sense. But that kind of then, begs the question: how on earth did they do it? How did they carry it out? Well, after Olympics accident with Hawke, she spent many weeks in the shipyard at Belfast, and I believe that they began to make changes to both ships, because they were almost identical, but they couldn't actually make them totally identical. But they tried to make the main differences in them. Tried to eradicate the main differences in them and make them as identical as possible, although it wasn't 100% practical. And so this is how the plot has been discovered, really, through meticulous research.
Also, sorry for jumping in. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to jump in from time to time.
Absolutely.
But if you think about it, these are new ships. And if people are going on a maiden voyage, they don't actually even know what the ship looks like.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, again, we'll come on to some of that stuff shortly. But yeah, it's a very valid point. Yeah, so there are lots of pictures showing them in various stages of transition, and using those pictures, you can actually tell that there was a switch made. Okay, so on the very final weekend, the last changes were made, and that involved changing the lifeboats, the menus and letterheads that were available in the lounges, and of course the nameplates, because everything else was just White Star standard issue. Those were the only things that actually bore the individual ships' names. And this exercise was carried out by a small crew of insiders, and these men were paid about £100 each. Now, in those days, £100 was about a year's salary. So they were paid £100 or a year's salary for one final weekend, but they were also threatened with the loss of livelihood in the event of their speaking out about it in any way. So, yeah, Olympics maiden voyage, which had taken place in June 1911, just under a year before the actual disaster, there was absolutely no fanfare whatsoever. Titanic was launched in December 1911, I believe. She was renamed the Olympic eventually, and work continued on the original Olympic, which was now Titanic, to make her seaworthy enough for one dramatic final voyage. There's so many photographs of the two ships in various stages of changes that even the so-called experts struggle to separate the two. And of course, most photographs in those days had no dates. And if surreptitious changes were being made alongside official ones, then the conclusion has to be that the photos don't prove anything. But in my book, RMS Olympic, there are a series of photographs that I believe does prove the switch. Okay, now, all passenger ships at that time, and as far as I know, even today there is something similar, but at that time it was called the Board of Trade Certificate of Seaworthiness. And this involved a sea trial on open seas, which involved things like stopping within a certain time frame or a distance, starting, turning circles, the size of the turning circles, the maneuverability, the adequate number of lifeboats, etc., etc. So just bear that in mind as well, everyone that's listening. On Wednesday, the 10th of April, 1912, Titanic left Southampton on its maiden voyage to New York amidst huge celebrations, calling at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown in Ireland. And it had 2,200 passengers and crew on board. Now, surprisingly to most people, it was only half full, which is very strange, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Why that might be, but before it actually set sail from Southampton, it had to be transported from Belfast down to Southampton, which is about 600 nautical miles, and there was a transit crew, like a skeleton crew, if you like, who were responsible for the safe passage of the liner from Belfast to Southampton before the maiden voyage. Now, only two of that crew signed on for the voyage. What did they know? Okay, and in addition to that, at that point in time in the British Isles in Great Britain, there was a coal strike going on. And what did liners in those days use as fuel? Coal. So there were lots and lots of liners, hundreds of them, laid up and lying empty because the coal strike had been going on for 6 weeks. And by the day of Titanic's sailing, passengers were getting absolutely desperate for berths. Yet Titanic was only half full. Now, there was a ship called the Californian, which now enters the story, the SS Californian, which was part of the Red Star Line, not the White Star Line. This was the Red Star Line, but it was still owned by JP Morgan, so it was still part of JP Morgan's shipping group. Okay, 5 days earlier, Californian departed for New York from London in the midst of this nationwide coal strike and shortage, with no passengers, despite huge demand at this time for transatlantic passengers, and no cargo at all, except for 3,000 woolen sweaters and 3,000 woolen blankets. In fact, even Titanic, as I said, sailed only half full when there was this huge demand for places. First-class passengers hoping to transfer to Titanic were only offered second-class cabins. And in those days, what self-respecting first-class passenger would accept a second-class cabin? It just wasn't going to happen. And I believe that was an attempt to keep the numbers manageable. Okay. So on the evening of the 14th, which was the evening of the disaster, SS Californian stopped dead in the middle of the ice field where Titanic was due to pass shortly and drifted with the ice whilst keeping all its boilers fully fired. Now, 3 experienced transatlantic sea captains gave evidence at the American inquiry that it was not, absolutely not, common practice to stop or even slow down in ice fields, except very occasionally in foggy conditions, because icebergs are extremely visible and thus avoidable.
Yes, but also they deliberately went close to ice. Is that something that was normal?
Yeah, but that area of the Atlantic, this was an ice field. It was full of icebergs. Okay, so it was unavoidable if you were going down that route. Okay, you couldn't avoid the ice field because it was massive. What happens is that obviously as spring marches on in the northern hemisphere, the Arctic ice starts to melt and break off, and it comes down the Atlantic, floats down the Atlantic. So by end of April, which is where we're at now, there are lots of icebergs in the North Atlantic. So in some respects, it's unavoidable. But yeah, Californian stopped dead in this ice field where Titanic was due to pass, keeping all its boilers fully fired, even though it wasn't common practice to stop or even slow down in ice fields, except very occasionally in foggy conditions. And this is because icebergs are extremely visible and thus avoidable even at normal cruising speeds. And the night of the 14th, 15th of April, there was no fog. It was an extremely clear, crisp night. It was freezing cold, but there was no fog. Okay, so then at 11:40 p.m. local time, Titanic allegedly, and I use that word advisedly, Titanic allegedly hit the iceberg and sunk 3.5 hours later with the loss of 1,500 lives. Begs the case and begs the question, was there even an iceberg? And we'll come on to that shortly. Now, interestingly, Titanic's turning circle, and again, this is all factual, it's not me making this stuff up, was such that it should easily have been able to spot the iceberg in good time and avoid it. Officially, it wasn't spotted until it was, quote, too late. But in reality, it was actually seen 4 miles away, which is all rather strange, of course. Now, I don't actually subscribe to the iceberg theory. I think that they actually passed quite close to an iceberg to give the impression that it had hit an iceberg. all the ice on the decks, and we know there was ice on the decks, but that could easily have been a result of the shaking loose of large amounts from the miles of overhead rigging and wiring due to thrusting engines into reverse, which is exactly what happened. When the alleged incident occurred, Titanic was thrust into reverse. Now, just imagine, for the effect of that, just imagine driving down the road and then suddenly slamming your car into reverse. Well, that's, that kind of thing will have a massive impact on ice, especially in a ship. But yeah, the damage to Titanic was also very, very strange. Its steel plates had a 15 centimeter wide puncture, which is about that, I guess, and that at some places penetrated 1.6 meters, which is about 5 feet in old money, into the inner skin of the ship. And that would have needed a really bizarre shaped ice crop or an iceberg to achieve that, and one that would surely have snapped off in contact with steel. And the other thing was, it's meant to have been 300 feet long, which was about a third of the length of the ship. So yeah, it's all very strange. But let's move on to another three. Go on, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, just adding to what you said, I remember reading somewhere, I honestly cannot remember where I read or saw this, but there was a report of an explosion which didn't align with the idea of the ship scraping along ice.
Yes, there was an explosion. We don't really know what it was. I mean, some people think that it was one of the boilers exploding when it came into contact with with the cold water, because the water was extremely cold. It was only something like 28 degrees centigrade or something. Sorry, 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is below freezing. That could have caused a boiler explosion, but there are various different theories about that, and we'll probably never know the real reason for that. So yeah, let's move on to the second string to this story now. In my book, RMS Olympic, I describe an intrinsic connection between the sinking of the Titanic and the formation of the Federal Reserve Bank in America and the US in 1913. And in 1910, this began. 7 prominent men who were representative of various different financial interests met totally incognito on a place called Jekyll Island, which is off the coast of Georgia, USA, to hatch this plan to usurp the power to create money from the American government. And the result of this was going to be the Federal Reserve Bank, which is the American central bank in effect, equivalent to, for example, the Bank of England in the UK. But this wasn't without strong opposition from certain mega-rich people. One of the main prime movers behind the Federal Reserve plans was a certain Mr. J.P. Morgan. Surprise, surprise. Who, as we've already discovered, he owned the White Star Line. And there were 4 extremely wealthy men at this time who were totally opposed to the Federal Reserve Plan. John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and Charles Lindbergh Sr. Charles Lindbergh was the father of the famous flyer. And not because of any altruism on their part, for the common people, but because they knew that the Federal Reserve Plan would mean soaring inflation and inbuilt debt, which would severely impact their own fortune. So that's why they were opposed to it. And they had actually created a strong resistance movement on the East Coast, which was beginning to win the battle against the Federal Reserve. And 3 of those men died on the Titanic. Now, the 4th one, the one that didn't die, Charles Lindbergh Sr., he wrote a book whose name escapes me. It's a while since I did this research, but he wrote a book and he was paid $200,000 not to publish it. Now, $200,000, 1910 dollars, it's many, many millions of dollars he was paid not to publish it, which he didn't.
Yeah, that's big money.
And it is, absolutely, yeah. So as I said, the other 3 died on the Titanic. Coincidence? Well, I'll let the listeners decide. Now, going back to the situation about there been no fanfare whatsoever for the Olympic, and that being the first off the production line, you'd expect the maiden voyage to be hyped up for that one, but no. It was the Titanic that seemed to get all this attention, and I believe that the rich and famous were lured in great numbers to this hyped-up maiden voyage by Morgan, who, by the way, mysteriously failed to show at Southampton docks in time for the departure of the ship he was meant to sail on the Titanic, along with around 50 of his friends and colleagues. And, you know, maybe that's how he lured Astor, Guggenheim and Strauss aboard by personal invitation and by booking a passage for himself. You know, that's just my speculation. But there you go. It's perfectly possible, I think. So let's look a little bit about how the accident was facilitated and how they expected to pull off the deception. Well, obviously it was no accident. Now, I believe that Stanley Lord, who was captain of the Californian, remember the ship that got stuck, that was parked up in the ice field? I believe he was in on the plot because, as I said, the Red Star Line, which owned the Californian, was also owned by J.P. Morgan. Now, several years previously, Stanley Lord had successfully evacuated 2,000 people from a ship in an exercise in under an hour. So, perfect man for the job. And I believe it was his intention to save most of the passengers and allow a select few to become victims to cover up the disposal of the Federal Reserve conspirators. Because if they'd just been bumped off in any old way, it would look rather suspicious. But who would believe that there was a conspiracy going on when they just died as part of, you know, a few thousand other people? So I think the idea was that the Californian would be standing by, complete with 3,000 blankets and 3,000 sweaters, to pick up most of the survivors. Several passengers said afterwards, survivors obviously, that they'd been told by White Star Line staff on the ship at the time that not to worry because the Californian was on its way to pick them up. What a giveaway. Californian was totally incommunicado, 19 miles away, with its wireless switched off and beyond visible contact. And there'd been no communications at all between Californian and Titanic up till that point, other than 3 messages from Californian, or possibly 4, to Titanic, general messages giving their position. That was it. So, you know, where the White Star Line staff, senior White Star Line staff, had got this idea that Californian was on its way to pick them up, your guess is as good as mine. And, you know, those people that made that statement would not have been privy to the, to the fact that Californian had been transmitting its position. Now, yeah, as I said, it's absolutely, totally uncertain as to whether she actually hit an iceberg, and she was possibly deliberately steered into one, or maybe, possibly, as we kind of alluded to before, maybe sunk by a boiler explosion or another ship. I don't know. We'll never know. But, you know, I can only tell you the facts that I know. Now, one eyewitness afterwards swore that he'd seen what he described as a yellow funneled ship directly alongside at the time of the incident. And this is known as the yellow funnel steamer mystery. This ship was seen in the vicinity of Titanic at the time of the sinking by crew members of the Californian. And indeed, when the Carpathia, which was the ship that picked up all the survivors, when she picked them up, there was a lifeboat that was floating there that was of a different colour and design to that of Titanic, an empty lifeboat, which, you know, did that come from the yellow-funnelled steamer as a result of a collision with Titanic? Who knows? Was the ship some kind of an icebreaker or something that would damage Titanic? Well, we just don't know. It's all speculation. But yeah, so Carpathia came along and picked up all the survivors of 705 people about 3.5 hours after the ship sank. And she was fitted out like a hospital ship and had 7 doctors on board, weirdly. And even at the time, both inquiries, both the American and the British, were widely thought to be whitewashers. There were no witnesses called from the passenger contingent at all, except for the Gordon's Gin family, the Gordon's Gin, the famous gin company. No witnesses were allowed to give personal evidence, and they were strictly forbidden from speaking, other than to give simple answers to direct questions without elaboration. And when questioned by the press, Captain Lord of the Californian said, and I quote, "I am not allowed to give out state secrets. You will have to ask those in the office." Very enigmatic. What on earth did that mean? Well, we can only speculate. And upon arrival at the surviving crew members back in England 2 weeks after the disaster, they were all illegally detained overnight in a holding pen in Plymouth docks without access to any legal or union representation, and were coerced into signing a document that they believed was the Official Secrets Act. The Official Secrets Act had been put into place a couple of years earlier in readiness for war, because they knew that war was imminent, and it gave the government the power to detain people, imprison people, if they gave away anything that they deemed to be an official secret. So that was the document that these guys believed that they'd signed. So there was only 5 witnesses to the fact that she'd hit an iceberg. Murdoch, the first officer, William Murdoch, the 2 lookouts in the crow's nest, the helmsman, and 1 other ordinary seaman. And significantly, Murdoch committed suicide in the aftermath of the collision, leaving as the only surviving witnesses, 4 working class men. And I emphasize that working class men because it was far, far easier to keep them quiet through threats to their and their families' future livelihoods. And obviously I believe that that's exactly what happened, and I provide evidence for that in the books. Now, was Titanic set up by Captain Smith? Captain Smith was the captain of the Titanic, on the orders of J.P. Morgan, to enter an ice field at high speed against total common sense, with the intent of ramming her with the yellow front steamer, which could well have been an icebreaker, as I said before, in order to provide a plausible cover story, to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, collect the insurance payout for the wrecked Olympic, and also, excuse me, God, my voice is going, excuse me, and also to rid the Federal Reserve conspirators of their powerful enemies. There were 6 significant deaths: Captain Smith himself, Chief Officer Wilde, First Officer Murdoch, all of whom I suspect have been privy to the plan, plus Guggenheim, Strauss and Astor, the anti-Fed res guys. And there is no real eyewitness evidence of what happened to any of them at all. According to the official legend, none of them attempted to escape. Captain Smith allegedly decided to go down with his ship. Murdoch allegedly shot himself. Captain Smith decided to go down with the ship, as I said. Murdoch allegedly shot himself. Why? Guggenheim allegedly, according to all the Titanic legend, he dressed in his best and prepared to go down like a gentleman. Astor apparently just walked away, never to be seen again, after being denied access to a lifeboat with his wife. And we're told that Strauss and his wife retired to their stateroom to await death together peacefully. All very romantic and melodramatic stuff, not to mention very convenient. But it's highly significant to me that Guggenheim, Astor and Strauss were all well known to be opponents of the Federal Reserve System. And significantly, they were also the most well known of the victims, very few of whom, incidentally, were first-class passengers. So it's rather strange that of the first-class passengers, of which a very high percentage survived, that those 3 all didn't. You'd think at least 1, possibly 2, as the law of averages goes, would have survived, but no. There weren't that many first-class deaths, but yet all 3 of those didn't survive. So the upshot was that Morgan got his insurance payout, and the Federal Reserve came to pass the following year, with little to no resistance, which obviously enabled the elite to begin the next phase of the Grant Plan in 1914 and engineer the outbreak of World War I, which is exactly what happened. And again, I go into more details about that in the book. World War I had been planned as early as 1890, but finance was needed to do it, and the Federal Reserve provided that. because obviously the Federal Reserve came to pass the following year after the Titanic incident, and all the all the opposition had been removed because the campaign just fell apart when those three who were the main guys involved in it. It just fell apart once they were all dead. Okay, so now I believe that the British government of the day were also complicit in this scheme, because they knew that if Olympic had to be scrapped, then there's no doubt at all that Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilders, and White Star Line would have gone too. It's almost certain that Morgan would have cut his losses and pulled out, and the damage to the British economy, the unemployment figures that would have resulted, 30,000 alone at Harland and Wolff, similar amount at White Star, several more thousand plus associated dependent industries, then the Liberal government would surely have faced a humiliating defeat in the next election. So that's why I believe that the British government was complicit in it. Now, here we come on to the propeller thing. When Titanic's wreck was investigated by Robert Ballard, he saw some mysterious, unaccounted for in the blueprints, thick steel support struts bracing the keel, which were consistent with the alleged repairs to Olympic after the Hawke incident. And what's more, when the propeller, one of the propellers on the alleged Titanic at the bottom of the sea was exposed, it bore the stamp of Titanic's build number 401, which a lot of people say proves that it was actually Titanic down on the seafloor. But no, not necessarily, because what happened was they borrowed the propellers off the unbuilt Titanic. So that it would,
the propellers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, it's a very long, complicated story, and there's also there's another. If I've got time, there's another interesting little snippet I've got here. This was, am I okay? There was. First of all, let's say it was a common scam in those days to switch ships' identities. So this wasn't a one-off. This was a common thing in those days, for insurance fraud. Now, there's a guy by the name of Lewis Klein, he was a witness to this, but his name has been expunged from the crew list. But we know that he was a member of the crew because he actually was subpoenaed. And again, this appears in the American inquiry transcripts. He was subpoenaed to appear at the inquiry, but he escaped. He was held under lock and key, but he managed to escape the day before the inquiry, and nobody ever saw him again. Now, this guy could speak no English. He was Austro-Hungarian, and he apparently shouted a warning to the lookouts and to the bridge. There was no one there. But let me give you the testimony. I've just brought it up here. His testimony said, this is testimony that was read out in the American inquiry. He said there was a ball following a banquet of some kind going on down below when I went up on watch at 9:30 o'clock. And the captain and the officers were there with many passengers. After the party, the stewards sent the champagne and wines that were left over to the crew. I know that many of them were drunk. A passenger standing at the rail saw something dead ahead, or maybe a little to the starboard. Look, quick, see the hill over there. I saw it was a big iceberg and ran for the bridge. The third officer was coming and yelled to me to ask what the matter was. I couldn't stop to answer, I was too excited. I ran for the spar with the crow's nest on it and shouted to the lookout I knew was up there to give the alarm. Not a word did I hear, so I started up the spar. It was less than a minute after I left the promenade deck that I got to the top of the spar and found the lookouts fast asleep. I rang the alarm bell myself. So there you go. Now, the insurance scam, we are really getting to the end now. Titanic cost 2.5 million to build, 2.5 million pounds. And of course, the badly damaged Olympic was uninsurable. White Star Line normally insured ships for 75% of the value, so therefore the payout for Titanic would have been around 1.8 million. In fact, the insurance on Titanic was upped the week before the maiden voyage to 3.2 million, which Lloyd's of London paid out within a week of the disaster. Yeah, so where have we heard this story about upping insurance before? I'm sure this rings a bell for a lot of people. Yeah, could it have been 9/11? Yeah.
But now tell me something, John.
Yeah.
The actual footage of the ship at the bottom of the ocean, I've seen some of it. And although it's difficult to make out what's going on, there certainly is evidence of the ship that's at the bottom of the ocean not being the Titanic itself.
Yeah. Now, I think I know the piece of footage that you refer to. Is it the one where the letters on the nameplate are that you can actually clearly, not clearly, but you can vaguely see an M and a P? Yeah, I'm not sure whether that's fake.
Oh, and there's also something about the hull, not the hull, but you know the one I'm talking about.
Oh, where the cabins, the shape of the windows in the cabins are slightly different on Titanic and Olympic.
Yeah,
and the ship down below the sea has definitely got Olympic-shaped cabin windows, not Titanic-shaped cabin windows. Absolutely, yeah. That was one of the things that they couldn't possibly have changed because it would have taken too much time, cost too much money. So, yeah.
But I mean, also, again, at the end of the day, anybody who was climbing onto the ship for the first time would never have known.
No, absolutely. It was,
they wouldn't have known about the switch because they didn't know what the original ship looked like.
Exactly. And the people say to me, everything would have looked worn and second-hand. Yes, the main thing that would have been looked worn was the floor. But they actually, Olympics was just a tile floor throughout the entire ship, but they actually carpeted it. Titanic was carpeted, so that covered up all the scuff marks on the tile floors. So yeah, everything else would have been easily covered up. Yeah.
You said you had something to say about the captain.
Oh yeah, have I got time?
Yes.
I've got time. Yeah. Okay. Right.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I had my mic on mute.
All right. What if Captain Smith actually survived against all the odds, but that fact was suppressed, possibly to prevent his testifying at the inquiries? You might think that's ridiculous, but there is some evidence to back up this premise. I uncovered a newspaper report from the 21st of July 1912 in the Washington Herald, and it said, Baltimore, July 20th, 1912. Peter Prial, a wealthy retired mariner of this city, who was a shipmate of Captain Smith of the Titanic for 17 years, declared today that he saw Captain Smith in Baltimore yesterday and spoke with him. He said he met him on the street on Thursday and accosted him, but the captain brushed by him angrily. The next day, he declared, he saw him again and followed him around the city to a railroad station where the captain bought a ticket for Washington. Just as he was about to pass through the gates, Prial declared, the man turned to him and greeted him by name. I'm on business. Don't worry me, Prial, he said. Be good to yourself, old shipmate, till we meet again. Prial is now under the care of a physician, suffering from nervous shock brought on by the experience. His physician declared he is absolutely sane, he's well known in Baltimore and an active church member. So, what do we make of that? I mean, firstly, it could hardly have been a case of mistaken identity, as Smith actually spoke to him. And in return, he was addressed not only by his name, but also shipmate, and also this guy was a retired, wealthy mariner. It could be argued that it was simply a case of Prial trying to make a fast buck out of the episode. But on the contrary, it would seem that he would have everything to lose, nothing to gain by relating his experience to a newspaper. He appears to be a normal, upstanding, church-going member of society, and he was declared absolutely sane by his doctor. So how else would we explain it, unless, of course, it's the truth? And then on the 12th of February 1940, in the 12th of 1940, 12th of February 1940 issue of Life magazine, there is a letter from a guy by the name of Charles Wilson, which states as follows. 28 years ago, Captain E.J. Smith of the Titanic disappeared in New York. 3 years later, an unknown penniless man, whom local police call Silent Smith, died in Lima, Ohio. The stranger wouldn't talk except to mutter Smith when asked his name. Undoubtedly, he was a seaman. The Rock of Ages was tattooed on his chest. A map of the Pacific was tattooed on his back. His height and weight were the same as the Titanic's Captain Smith. Embalmed by a local undertaker, Silent Smith's body has been kept on display in an effort to identify him. No one has yet been able to do so. And yeah, there's a lot more information about that. But that's just a, if Smith did survive, he must have been on board Carpathia, because Californian was far too late in arriving and only turned up after everybody had, got onto Carpathia. So upon Carpathia's arrival in New York, Captain Rostron of the Carpathia, his priority seemed not to disembark Titanic's traumatic passengers at the first opportunity, but to unload Titanic's lifeboats at the White Star Pier. Maybe Smith and possibly others were concealed within them lifeboats, and could this be another reason that Rostron maintained radio silence until he got to New York, which he did, and until the story, which was meant for public consumption, had been agreed upon by the perpetrators. As with everything else, we'll never know for sure, but at the very least, it's an intriguing possibility, I would suggest. There's a lot more to that, by the way, as there is to the entire story. But that's kind of a taster, if you like.
No, well, I think you've covered the meat, which is, I would argue, very persuasive. I mean, the other thing that we mustn't forget is that the Titanic was a ship of its time. There was no social media. It was very difficult to counter-argue what was going on in the shipyard because people were just simply not let in.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, there was no social media. There were no news reporters, no TV crews, no, wireless people looking for stories. It was a very, very different world 110, 113 years ago. Very, very different. And it would have been much easier. You probably couldn't do it today. You probably could not do the Titanic deception today because it would be leaked within minutes and it'd be viral. Yeah.
And a very important part of the story is the fact that the official narrative that keeps getting repeated is based on a book by a guy who worked for the CIA.
Exactly, and that really rang alarm bells in my head when I found that out, and I thought, what on earth was a CIA agent doing, writing a book about a sea accident, 40 years previously, as I said right at the beginning? It just didn't ring true to me at all. And that book, the contents of that book have become the official story.
John, how can I get your book and in actual fact follow your work?
Yeah, well, I have a website called falsificationofhistory.co.uk. You can order all my books, and all 9 of them, please do, from there directly, but only if you're in the UK, sadly, because of shipping abroad is very, very difficult. It's become almost impossible lately. Get so many books turned away and returned and just disappearing altogether. Refused by customs is another thing. So I only post signed copies in the UK, but the ubiquitous Amazon, is for anyone who's worldwide. All my books are on there on my author page. If you just search my name, John Hamer, there I am. But yeah, people in the UK can order signed copies direct from my website. Which also, as well, I mean, the website also contains lots and lots of interesting articles as well, that I've written over the years. And, all my podcasts are on there, for example. I always put a link to my podcasts. Some of them are sadly broken now after many, many years. But, there's still, dozens, if not hundreds of my podcasts on there. So,
John Hamer, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure as always, my friend.